please put your back.
Okay. Okay, so let's get started for today. Hopefully everybody noticed I did get all of your case studies graded over the weekend. I apologize for the delay in getting those posted, but they are now posted, so your grades are fully up to date, including perusal for, I have not put in today's perusal grade, but everything else is up to date, so everyone knows where you stand. As was pointed out to me on Friday, there was language in the case studies that suggested that only two, or your best two case studies would be considered for your case study grade. So I've made that adaptation in the grade book just to avoid any questions. And I can tell that that significantly improved some of your grades, so you're welcome. Okay, so for today, we are going to be looking at experimental research. So we have readings for Wednesday and Friday, and then we will be on to our final project, the research proposal. That starts next week. In the email that I sent out on this weekend, when I posted your grades, I hope that many of you noticed, I saw direct correlation between attendance in class and scores on the case study. This should not be a surprise. I bring that up because I would strongly encourage those who are online to make every effort to be in class starting next week for the rest of the semester. Okay, there are still quite a few points between now and the end of the semester that can improve your grade or hurt your grade depending on your performance. And having said that, that's why I really want you to encourage you to start making plans and arrangements to be here in class if at all possible. Okay? Anybody have any questions about that? Okay. Hearing none, let's get started. So we talked this week, or in our chapter for today, talked about the concept of experimental research. And I think Joseph asks the critical question about halfway through the chapter, and I moved it to the front because I think it's probably the most important question to answer before we go anywhere. Why do we have to learn about experimental design?
Learning about different types of designs, even if they're experimental, it widens our understanding of what could be done and our options.
Okay. All right. Anybody else? Well, let's talk about this for a second. It is very, very unlikely that many of you or any of you are likely to engage in experimental research as it has been described in this chapter. So, other than because I'm in charge of the class and what I say goes, how might I answer the question, is it important to learn this? Are your lives affected by people who do experimental research?
Yes.
How so?
Our lives are affected by people who do experimental research because, like, for example, like at work, you're going to, if you're in part of a big company, they're going to have research teams trying to get every bit of efficiency out of your group. Besides that, if we go into a more medical side of the scientific field, people are currently doing different types of research on like how to cure corona, and some of that research is also very experimental.
Okay. Anybody here of something called Operation Warp Speed? It has nothing to do with Star Trek. Operation Warp Speed is the title of the government's efforts to produce the coronavirus vaccine. You'll probably hear references to a vaccine just about every day, regardless of what news media outlets you listen to, right? Now, why would a corona vaccine be so important? Could it be important? How so? Joseph, you're kind of nodding your head, so I'm going to pick on you.
I mean, could a vaccine help out with kind of ending the pandemic or us wearing a mask pretty much?
Okay, so it could have a dramatic impact on the degree to which corona affects our day-to-day lives. I get to go back to teaching without having to try to hold my breath for an entire hour. You as well, right? It could have a dramatic impact on our economy because we would be able to associate in larger groups. We would be able to interact with each other without having pandemic outbreaks. This is all big, big deal stuff. What's the problem with Operation Warp Speed, or potential problems with Operation Warp Speed? What is it doing?
The issue with that is once you do get it out, because they're rushing it so quickly, there's a good chance of failure or making things worse if not done correctly.
Okay, so we're talking about a vaccine that, if it becomes available, millions of people, billions if we look worldwide, would demand access to this quarantine, correct? If we have not adequately followed the correct protocols on how to test and determine the impact of the vaccine before it is administered, the most immediate and terrible consequence could be what?
Death.
Death or severe side effects. Okay, that's bad. What else could happen? What if we see the vaccine and it doesn't work? Or it causes death and serious side effects? What will happen to our attitude about the vaccine after that?
Any scientific research on it will be taken with bad prejudice because we've already had a bad experience with it. How can we trust the sources again?
Exactly. It undermines our faith in the medical testing process. So as much as we want this process to be done quickly because we want the positive benefits of having a vaccine, we also recognize the danger in not completing experimental design in the way, or experimental research in the way it has been established over centuries. Why is it so important to follow those processes and procedures? What are they intended to do?
To keep us safe and to keep the researchers safe.
Okay? Actually, I'm going to disagree with that. That's not why those things are in place. It's not because we want to keep people safe, as crazy as that sounds.
Add validity to the research?
We have to be concerned with the validity of the research. We have to make sure that we follow the integrity of the research, because it's not just the outcomes we're worried about, it's how we got there. If we violate those protocols, it makes it difficult for us to be able to ever be able to do that kind of research again. All it takes is one batch of bad vaccine and nobody is going to want to take it. Now, Christy, I'm going to pick on you for a second because I know we've talked about this in our ethics course. One of the things that is required before a product like a vaccine can be distributed, what has to happen first?
They have to do the trials.
You have to do human trials, and there's several different stages of those trials, right? And one of the problems that happened in the United States was what?
No one was willing to volunteer for the test.
Okay, so the companies that were making these drugs had to go through FDA mandated trials before the drug could be released to the public. And when you were giving this drug to people and they were having bad side effects, that got out and people knew it was dangerous to participate in drug testing. Because that was the case, drug companies had to start paying people to participate in those studies. Is that wrong? No. They are exposing themselves to risk, and it makes sense for them to be compensated. That's an ethic of a scientific and ethically appropriate action. But guess what started happening? People started realizing, as much as I need money, the risk of some of the side effects that can happen. I mean, how many of you have listened to drug commercials, either on TV or radio? They are required by law to do what as part of the drug commercial?
List the side effects.
List possible side effects. Now, these side effects can be fairly serious, right? These can lead to heart attack, stroke, or death. There are other drugs out there that create other things that are just as bad, or if not worse. Okay, if you read some of the symptoms that can occur because of these drug trials, they're pretty scary. People knew about this and they decided that the money was just not good enough. So drug companies had to start going to third world countries where the same amount of money would have much more impact to try to get people to take or to participate in the drug trial. The problem is you're talking about people who are less informed, less capable of being able to make an intelligent decision about whether they should participate or not, because they don't have the foundation and education to be able to understand the significance of what people are saying. And as a result, they question the ethics of going to third world countries where if you take this drug, we'll give you a doctor's visit. And that in and of itself is worth so much to those folks that they would be willing to expose themselves to incredibly harmful drugs that have not been adequately gone through. So the reason why I feel that this is a class or that this topic is important is not about whether or not you will be able to actually use the knowledge of this chapter to complete coursework, as much as all of you will be consumers of experimental research and its products. Each one of you is going to have to decide if and when a vaccine is produced, do I take it myself? Do I expose my family to this vaccine? And you need to be able to make an intelligent, informed decision. Right? That's why we're covering this, because this is not just about academics, it's about your role as members of our society. How do I make informed decisions about what I do and do not trust? And in order for me to trust, I have to understand the fundamental principles of how products are made. How are they delivered? How can I intelligently decide if it's good or bad for me to take this? That's why we're covering this. Okay? So one of the interesting phrases in the book, and this really gets at the author's background, is the author says that experimental research is often considered the gold standard of research. What do you think? What would make experimental research the gold standard? What do we mean by gold standard anyway? The gold standard was, it basically meant, it used to be that in order for a country to have currency, it had to have enough gold to back up every single dollar note that was floating around. What we call the gold standard, if you have enough gold to back it up. So they're saying that experimental research is the highest standard of research. What do you think? Do you agree with that statement?
It probably produces what we consider basic definition of data sets compared to some others.
Not necessarily. They all produce data. What happens, okay, so the idea of experimental research, what does it try to do at its core? What is it looking at?
New kinds of research?
Not necessarily new kinds of, no. Experimental research does not have this idea of tests of unique or untried. That's a term, that's a meaning for the word experimental, but that is not what it's talking about in this case. The entire idea of experimental research is a test of treatments. What do I mean by treatments?
The cause.
We are examining cause and effect, right? We are examining different variables in an environment to determine the treatment effect of an independent variable on a dependent variable. So, many of you have taken a class that will, to some degree or another, talk about statistics, right? Many of you shudder when you think about that word. Trust me, You haven't seen anything yet. I had to go through 3 doctoral level stats courses, and it was agonizing. But it was because I was at the stage where I was actually about to start doing this stuff. And they had to make sure I understood how to do it correctly. Now, again, just like I talked about before, why do we teach statistics? Why do you need to understand things like standard deviation, margin of error? Why do we care about that stuff?
To disclose how valid our experiments were, how
Okay.
accurate they are.
All right. Now, the thing is, are you guys going to be producing the research, realistically speaking? No. But you will be consuming it. What do I mean by consuming it? Normally, when we think of the word consume, it means to eat something.
That's when we'll be doing the literature review process.
You're going to be doing literature review. You're going to be reading about the research that other people have done. Okay? That's true for this class. But this is an academic setting. Is this accurately reflective of your entire lives outside of school? No. So does that mean that statistics and experimental research is only valid in the classroom? No. We just talked about the idea of the coronavirus and the implications of Operation Warp Speed. As a citizen, you will consume research, meaning you will live according to the impact or effect of what research finds. You will shape your behavior to a degree on whether or not the science you consume is believable to you or not. Right? So a classic example would be climate change. Now, whether or not you agree with it or not, what are we really saying when we talk about agreeing with or disagreeing with climate change?
We believe if it exists or not.
We believe whether or not it exists based on what? Are you guys going out and doing environmental studies? No, you're not. Are you going to go in and read the literature created by environmental scientists? Probably not. Okay? So how do you consume or act on climate science research? Realistically.
It gets advertised.
Okay, it gets advertised, it's discussed in the news, but even then, those are general information. I mean, that in and of itself might affect your behavior a bit about like how serious you are about recycling, how serious you are about maybe gaining access to alternative energy sources. But realistically, the biggest way that we consume science as an American culture right now is by whom we elect as political representatives. Why? How does that, what do I mean by that?
Because people believe the word of our political, the people in charge.
Maybe, maybe not. But in about a week, what's about to happen?
Presidential election.
We have an election cycle, right? Now, this one happens to be a presidential election, but there are other people being elected at this time as well, correct? Okay, most climate science is represented by law and regulations that are passed at the state and national levels. Am I right? That's where most environmentalism takes place, in the laws and regulations that are passed to decide what we can and cannot do. Our understanding of science, hopefully, will help us to decide how to act upon what we know about the policies and procedures that our elected officials do or do not follow. And I hope I'm being very clear. I am not advocating for one party or another in any way. But political elections have direct implications on how science is either adhered to or ignored. And whether science should be listened to or not. Just because science says something, does that mean that it's correct? We already know that laws and theories are true for now. We recognize that new findings can change that, right? We've seen that in the coronavirus, in what we should or shouldn't do with wearing masks and social distancing and things, and that everyone's getting really frustrated because it seems like scientists are doing what?
Nothing.
What?
Nothing.
Nothing? Or that they're changing their minds? And they're going back and forth, and it makes it difficult for us to know what should I do, because even the experts can't seem to agree with each other as to what's going on. Part of that has to do with our ability as American citizens to interpret the research and the information that is coming to us. To say that I don't need to know means that you don't have to have a responsibility when you vote about how the person you elect is going to implement law and regulation. You see the connection here? Okay? This is why you need to understand science to a fundamental degree. Not because you're going to do it, but you need to understand it so you can make intelligent decisions. Because they don't just affect you. They affect everybody around you. And that's why we need to learn this to the degree that we're covering in this class. Not so that you can become active scientists on your own. That's not my purpose here. But it's so you have a fundamental understanding about how all of this works together. Okay? All right. So when we talk about the author's concept that experimental research is the gold standard, it tends to mean that it's the gold standard because is it easy to do experimental research? From what you read in this chapter, it is a freaking pain in the tuchus to do experiment because you have to do what? What's the biggest thing that you have to do in experimental research that you don't necessarily have to do as much in other kinds of?
Because a lot of the time you're either the first person to do it or you are somebody following up on like maybe one other person. It's all very new. It's all things that you have to discover for yourself.
Okay. Normally it requires a lot of thinking and organization. What else do I have to do?
Because you have to account for certain factors.
I have to account for everything that could change or shape the outcome, right? I have to create an environment, normally in a lab, that strips out everything except for the two specific things I want to look at. Okay, we're about to talk about that in a second. But this idea that I have to control everything about that is incredibly difficult to do. If I'm doing surveys, I don't have to do as much control as I might in a lot of other settings. Okay? So in order for us to understand this, we have to understand kind of fundamentally, how do we engage in hypothesis testing? Hypothesis testing is basically the scientific method that you've heard about in high school for years. I begin the scientific method by establishing what? Some kind of hypothesis. What is an hypothesis?
educated guess.
It is an educated guess based on my previously acquired knowledge about what I think is going to occur in some type of controlled environment. Hypothesis testing focuses on two what we call variables. Variables are what?
Things that can change.
Things that can change. And what I want to determine is the nature and rate of that change. Okay? So then we have the independent and the dependent variable. Which one can change? The independent or the dependent? Which one do I change in an experiment?
Independent.
The independent. The independent one is the one I can control. It's the one I change. So what does the dependent variable do?
It is your like if you have your x, y values, the dependent value is going to be your flat equals 0 or something like that.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It's the thing that I want to see if it changes. So for example, if my room is cold and I turn on the fire, which is the independent variable?
The fire.
The fire. I can control that, right? The dependent variable would be what? The temperature in the room. The expectation would be if I turn on the fire in the living room, what should it do to the room temperature?
Raise it.
It should raise it, right? So dependent, and this is why I was disagreeing with you a little bit, Reese. Dependent variables can and should change. They can change positively or negatively. But what we need to determine is if the change in the dependent variable is connected to what? The independent variable. What we want to see is if y changes, can we show whether or not that change is directly connected to x? Now, Javier asked the question about, the book talks about this thing called extraneous variables. What are extraneous variables? Look at the very first part of the word.
It's like an unexpected variable.
Yes, it's the variable that we didn't think about. It's the fact that I opened the door to another room while I was trying to figure out if the fire increased the temperature. How could opening the door change the temperature in the room? Cold air outside or hot air outside that comes into the room and affects the temperature. It changes the temperature in the room. Does it have anything to do with the fire going on though? No. So what we have to do is we create a situation where we can examine only the independent variable and the dependent variable, and we control or remove effects of extraneous variables. We remove anything else that could change things except for independent and dependent. That's what makes experimental testing so hard, is how do I figure out exactly how to measure the dependent variable, how to control the presence of the independent variable, and eliminate the presence of all extraneous variables. So let's think about nursing, for example. We know that if objects are in a surgical field and they are contaminated, and a surgical field is the area immediately where surgery is about to take place. If we know that we have objects that are contaminated and they enter into the surgical field, what is likely to happen to the patient?
Infection.
We're going to get infection. So, what are some things that I can do to limit or eliminate infection? I can sanitize the tools.
Limit visitors,
What's that?
limit visitors, so who can go in and out.
I can limit other people present that might be near the surgical field. What else?
You could sterilize the wound.
I can sterilize the room. As the person who's going to be engaged in the surgical field, I mean, every single medical show you've ever seen, before people go in to commit to do surgery, unless it's in an emergency, what do they tend to do? This incredible, elaborate hand washing kind of thing where I have to walk around with my hands up in the air before I put on several things of gloves and gowns and masks and all this kind of stuff, all in an attempt to do what? Eliminate any source that could introduce infection into the surgical area. That's what this is all about. What can we do, what can we test that will decrease the likelihood of infection? It's a critical question in the medical field, right? So Colin asks, other than drug research, we talk about this idea of treatment, right? What is treatment? What's a way of describing treatment using this concept of independent and dependent variables?
It's what we're doing to, it's the independent variable, what we're changing to get an outcome.
Exactly. Okay, so a treatment is any change we make to the independent variable to see if we can get the kind of change we want in what? The dependent variable. Okay, so when we talk about multiple treatment group research, what are we talking about there? What would another phrase or another term be for multiple treatments? Treatments has a very medical kind of vibe to it. So what's another word we might be able to swap out for treatment?
Multivariable.
A variable, that's true and accurate, but it's kind of still a little confusing. What if I was to say multiple changes? Let's say that we have noticed that high school students are not doing very well in their morning classes, which is actually very true. The science shows high school teenagers tend to not do well in early morning classes. Okay, what would the dependent variable in that kind of research be?
The dependent variable would be the time that they are starting, because it's talking about specifically them starting off early.
Okay, that's not what we're talking about. That is not the dependent clause. Remember, the thing is that what we're
100% on the assignment.
Can we put okay, thanks. The dependent variable is not the fact that they're taking classes in the morning. It's that they are not doing well in those early morning classes. Okay, so it's their performance. So what am I going to want to test?
The time.
Well, I could test the time that they take the classes and see if that improves their performance. What else could I test? What other kinds of things might affect their performance? The grade, the performance in the class is the dependent variable. And I want to see what changes can I make that are likely to increase their performance. The time of the class is one. The amount of food they have before they come to class is another one. Any others? What's the kind of subjects that they have? It might be that certain kinds of subjects just never make somebody take an early morning math class. Okay, excellent. Anybody else?
Amount of sleep that they have.
The amount of sleep that they have. This is what we were talking about in terms of multiple treatment groups. Is that I can look at each one of those things, and what else could I do? I can also combine them. So I might say, well, it's a question of what class they take and when they take it. That's two different independent variables, right? Or I might combine sleep with food, or sleep with subject, or sleep with time. And I can create all of these different combinations of treatments to see which one of them is most likely to result in the highest level of change. Why would that be a big deal?
Because if you are able to do multiple small things to do a big thing, why do that instead of doing one big thing that does a big thing?
Okay, so the thing is this could affect our scheduling a curriculum, right? If I discover that high school students do not do well in early morning classes, I might need to move those classes later on in the day. If I do that, what happens?
Then you end up getting schedules where your harder classes or classes that you deem that can't be done in the morning, they're now at the later part, and those teachers who are teaching those subjects don't have a job during that time.
Okay, it would affect the employment of teachers, right? And most of the time, teachers teach multiple courses over the course of the day, right? If I cut out all morning classes, I'm not going to have as many teachers available because they can only teach so many classes at the same time, contrary to school district policy about online teaching. Sorry, that was I did get a little political today, I apologize. Okay, it affects when kids go to school, so it's going to affect transportation and busing. It's going to affect when students get out of school, which affects childcare. It's going to affect when kids, especially in high school, if kids can get jobs and have after-school activities. On and on and on and on, right? So this is where science really does come into effect, because it's how we end up making decisions. And we have to understand what's the size, or what are the signs of good science and bad science. Okay? Oscar asks, and this gets back to our conversation about Operation Warp Speed. How does testing a segment of the population gain a drug approval for the entire population? We all react differently to drugs, so what is the argument to bypass this? What do you think? How can we give a drug to the entire population when it's only been given to a small group of people in a drug test?
We can do that by making sure that, without a doubt, that it's safe, by doing multiple tests on a small percentage on a good variation of people, not just the same thing. You have to keep a variation in mind, because when you're doing it on a large scale, now people aren't the same. They're going to be different, and people could have negative reactions. So we have to keep variation in mind.
Okay. This gets back to, what did we talk about when we talked about this idea? What is this talking about? How can we give the drug to the entire population when we've only tested it on a small group?
The statistics of that group.
The statistics of the group. While we do react differently to drugs, guess what? our biology is such that the possible reactions, is the situation where every single person reacts differently than every other person in the population? What do you think? Is it likely that every single person who ever takes a drug is going to react differently than every other person who has ever taken the drug?
No.
And ask the question.
No. Now, is it likely that there are going to be different reactions? Absolutely. And as we can identify what is likely to prompt those reactions, then as long as I get a sample that includes all of the possible reactions, have I done enough to be able to give it to the entire population?
And
Yes.
as teachers,
That's the fundamental concept of sampling. I get a group that is likely to have all or as many as possible of the likely reactions to whatever it is that we're testing, so that whenever we come out with our findings, they are as generalizable or inclusive as possible of the entire population. So that answers the question, Oscar. How can we give a drug to a population when the entire population hasn't had it? Is that we know enough about the entire population that we can make assumptions about who should and shouldn't be in the sample group.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And how do we know that? How can we know who belongs in the sample group? Do I have to figure that out every time? What do you think, Oscar?
I think you would have to put some work into to figure that out. I think you'd want to represent the population as well as you can. So another question that I had is, how do the big companies get past, I want to say, conflict of interest? Because I know some companies, like, kind of a funny example, but Viagra makes a pill, right? And that pill causes heart problems, and they also make the drug that helps these the heart problems that this pill causes. So how is something like that allowed? And what does the government do about that, or what do these regulations do about that?
That's a great question. So let's think about that. So if they create one medication, now bear in mind, so let's look at medication one, the one that causes heart problems. That pill is not intended to create heart problems. It's created to address a medically established problem. Now, since we're talking about Viagra, I would probably guess that it's possibly one that deals with erectile dysfunction.
Right.
And the drug company has to prove that this drug will adequately address the medical condition for which it is prescribed. So they have to be able to prove that the pill that Viagra makes will deal with erectile dysfunction. Okay? That's why it's allowed to be out on the market. Now, it creates a heart problem. So Viagra identifies that secondary problem and finds a new drug that deals with the treatment of the heart problem.
Right.
Now, the thing is, nobody's being forced to, it's not mandatory for anybody to take the erectile dysfunction drug. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah.
And they are upfront about the fact that if you take this drug, it is likely to cause this problem. They're not creating the problem. They're trying to treat one, and then they're creating a new drug to deal with the secondary one. So it's not necessarily a conflict of interest as long as they disclose taking this pill can cause this problem, and we happen to have another pill that we've created to deal with the secondary problem. As long as they are telling people, and people can make an informed decision aware of what the problems of the first drug are and aware of where the second drug is coming from.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, as long as you're telling people ahead of time so they can say, I understand this, I still want to treat the first problem, then whatever pharmaceutical company has no problems with coming up with a pill to deal with the secondary or offset problems. The
Right.
problem occurs if nobody knew that the first one caused what it did.
Hmm.
Does that help?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Okay, so I think, Javier, that we kind of discussed the idea of treatment manipulation. Does that adequately answer the question for you?
Yes.
The
it
idea
does.
of treatment manipulation is we make changes to which variable? The independent or dependent?
The independent.
Okay, that's what treatment manipulation is. It's variable change. It's what am I testing in a specific group to see if it has a different impact than other possible variable changes. So for example, I mean, schools will put kids in certain classrooms in the morning because there's more sun, because they want to see if sunlight has an impact on their emotional state, because that could improve their grades. Kids do better in brightly lit classrooms that feel warm and friendly. As opposed to, for example, there was a semester in college where I got to class at 7 o'clock in the morning and it was dark, and I was in cinder block walls until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I got out and it was still dark. So I had never seen the sun for an entire semester. It was really depressing, and my grades reflected it. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes.
All right. And we're almost out of time. Jesus, time just goes fast. All right. Okay, so talking about quasi-experimental research. Quasi-experimental research is different than experimental research because one of the elements that tends to identify or define experimental research is the sampling method. Okay, what sampling methods will experimental research tend to rely on? Starts with an R. Random. Why? Why do we want random?
So it's unbiased.
We want to eliminate potential bias in who does or doesn't participate. Quasi-experimental research recognizes, for example, I want to see how students in this class do. Is it random assignment?
No.
No, it's the people in that class. But I'm okay with that because I want to know about this class. I recognize this class does not then represent a broad population. It only represents what? This class. Does that make sense? Again, it all goes back to what? What is my research question? What do I want to know? Who do I want to know about? Tristan, you got a kind of confused look on your face. What you got for me? Mr. Lambert, it's past class and I have no idea. So we're going to call it good. All right? So, reading on Wednesday, reading on Friday. Next week, we start our research proposal. All right, everybody. Take care. We will see you on Wednesday.